My name is Roger Dickson. Today is July 17th, and I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee to interview Lowry F. Kline. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. We're here today on July the 17th, 2014 to interview Lowry Kline. Lowry, can you start us off by giving us your full name and date of birth and place of birth?
Full name is Lowry Franklin Kline. Born March 29th, 1940 in Loudoun, Tennessee.
And give us your family history. Who were your paternal grandparents?
Maternal,
paternal, go one at a time.
Maternal grandparents were O.C. and Mary Pettit, who grew up in Monroe County, actually Vonore, Tennessee, not too far from Loudoun. My paternal grandparents were William Lowry Kline the third. The second, William Lowry Kline II, and his wife was Elizabeth Clementine Blair, both of whom grew up in Loudoun, Tennessee.
What did they do for a living, your grandparents?
The Pettits, my maternal grandparents, did various things. My grandmother's family was from Monroe County for many, many years, many generations. They were the Ray family, and they were predominantly farmers and small merchants. I think my grandfather might have been kind of an itinerant handyman, and he ended up marrying my grandmother there, and they lived in Vonore all their lives. So he did various things. He was a bit eccentric, but very, very nurturing and enjoyable to be around, I remember as a child.
So your grandparents were alive when you were growing up?
All except my paternal grandfather, who died in a ferry accident in 1933. My paternal grandparents, their families had been in Loudoun since about 1795, actually, because the Blairs were there with a land purchased just north of the river in Loudoun when the land south of the river was still part of Cherokee Indian country, and the Blairs ran the ferry across the river there at Loudoun. And they also were farmers and merchants. After the Hiwassee Purchase, which was in 1819, all the land, as you probably know, Roger, from the Tennessee River to the Hiwassee River became available for white settlement. So a lot of the other ancestors that I had came in after that. So they, the ferry operated from early 1800s, like 1810 until 1940s. And the Blairs always ran it, and my paternal grandfather, by that time, he was actually helping on the ferry, so helping his in-laws, and died in an accident, unfortunately, in 1933. Right.
Tell us about your father. What's his name?
His name is James Franklin Kline, and he was the third son in the family. Was born in 1910, graduated from high school right in the beginning of the Depression, had two older brothers. Both of them were engineers, but my father never went to college. He, I think the Depression had a role in that, but by that time, most of the capital from the farming and ferry operations and all that had pretty well dissipated, so they were not wealthy people by any means. And so my father worked for a time doing various things. He was a TVA guard during the war. Then he went to work for Union Carbide in Oak Ridge as an electrical operator, and did that most of his life until he retired. My mother was she didn't go to college either, although she had an opportunity to go to Maryville College because she was an honor student in high school.
Where did she go to high school?
She went to Von Orr High School. But her family couldn't really, even though she had tuition offered to her, really didn't have enough funding really to pay her expenses. So she ended up going to work and working several years before she and my dad were married in, I think, 1939.
And you have siblings?
Have sibling, one brother, James O. Kline, who lives in Knoxville, and that's it.
Okay. Tell us what it was like growing up in Loudoun in the 1940s and 50s.
You know, I've always said that growing up in a small town in the 1950s was a absolutely idyllic circumstance, and that anyone who didn't experience it should be envious of, because it was those were years where it was very tranquil. We didn't have, drug abuse. We didn't have, people were different in those days, I think. I don't know, the atmosphere was different. It was more nurturing. It was fun, and it was a delightful time to grow up, particularly in a small town. Everybody knew everyone. We knew where all the bombs were buried and where the problems were and who to look out for and who not to. It was still a time of segregation, and we had a considerable number of African Americans in Loudoun, but we were separated from them, and it was because desegregation was still the way of life at that time. But we had African American friends that we would see from time to time, maybe on the street or in the school grounds and what have you. And we would always talk about our various sports activities and what have you. And we were convinced at the time that there's no way they could ever compete with us, for example, athletically. Little did we know that they were faster, bigger, stronger, and a lot more talented than we were.
Did you have any particular hobbies as you were growing up?
Boy Scouts and sports of various kinds. We did a lot of camping, hiking, and just enjoyed life because we had all of that fishing, hunting, boating. I mean, we had access to all of that. So, as I said, it was a wonderful time.
Where did you go to elementary school?
At Loudoun Elementary School.
And how?
We called it Loudoun Grammar School.
Yeah, and that went through the 6th grade, or?
Went through the 8th grade, actually.
So you went from there to Loudoun High School?
Went from there to Loudoun High School.
And when did you graduate from Loudoun High School?
1958 from Loudoun High School.
And you participated in sports in Loudoun High School?
Participated in sports.
Tell us about that.
Well, I think most everybody either participated in sports or would like to participate in sports. So we had a small class, small high school. I think we had 400 in the 4 grades. And we competed pretty well, I think, pretty effectively in football particularly. And it was a very good experience and very worthwhile, and it meant a lot to me and meant a lot at the time because
what sports
of the
did
teamwork. Football and basketball.
Okay. And what position did you play in football?
I was a quarterback.
You've explained to me that you had an inherent advantage in getting that position. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think I certainly was not a talented quarterback. I didn't have a strong arm, didn't have a lot of speed, but what I could do is size up defenses, and I knew the plays.
You could remember the plays.
I could remember the plays, so I knew what to call and when. So
that's a great advantage for a high school quarterback.
That's right, and the coach had to put me somewhere. So.
Yeah. And then after high school, did you have any part-time jobs or summer jobs while you were
in high school? Worked one summer in construction for a cousin in Loudoun. That was a real education. That was back before they had machines to do everything, so we ended up typically doing manual labor to haul concrete, lumber, whatever it was, and it was hard work. But it was good conditioning for certainly for football season. One summer I worked for my uncle, my dad's older brother, who had a business in South Alabama, hardware business, building supply business, ready-mix concrete business, and that was very educational because I really had the opportunity to see firsthand what the demands were for a small business owner and operator. So both those were good experiences.
When you were in high school, did any particular teacher or coach have a significant impact on your future?
You know, I remember all of the teachers and coaches for the most part, certainly, but all of the teachers certainly were very dedicated, hardworking, and I thought I benefited from the experiences that I had with all of them. There was two in particular that I remember. My Latin teacher and my English teacher in my, I guess, junior and senior years in high schools. They were probably a notch above the other teachers in terms of what their expectations might be. And they were very rigorous in their requirements. So I learned a lot about how to take examinations. And the way it worked there is that it didn't matter if you were an honor student or not. You still took the final examination. And they were a couple of hours usually. So it was not easy. And I think that helped me a lot later in college to be able to have that experience in high school so that college exams were not a shock and a surprise to me in terms of what you had to do to prepare for them.
Where did you go to college?
University of Tennessee.
How did you choose the University of Tennessee?
Well, it was certainly close by, 30 miles away. That was an advantage. The other advantage was that I was offered some scholarships and financial help to attend, and
not athletic scholarships.
Not athletic scholarships. Definitely not athletic scholarships. So, and my parents being in their fairly modest financial condition, this was a logical thing to do, even though I had, opportunities to go elsewhere. This one just made more sense.
Did you, when you went to UT, did you live on campus or did you commute?
Lived on campus.
From the outset?
From the outset.
All 4 years?
All 4 years.
Tell us a little bit about your activities in college, and what did you major in?
I started actually in engineering. Both my uncles were engineers. In high school, my I guess performance in algebra and geometry and all that, and the science courses were good. I enjoyed them. My uncles were engineers. Family was always kind of technically inclined, I suppose. Anyway, I started engineering, went 2 years in engineering, and did well. I worked in the summers, first 2 summers, while I was in undergraduate school, in the engineering department at Oak Ridge at Y12, and made really a good income there. I had saved enough those summers to really pay a lot of my next year's tuition. Of course, college was cheaper in those days, as you know, and that was a very good experience because I could see what it was like to be working in a fairly large corporate type environment. After 2 years, I decided I didn't enjoy it that much, and what I was really enjoying in terms of coursework were things like history, political science, and English. So I made the decision to switch majors after 2 years. They still hired me back the next summer in the engineering department. So I had 3 summers really working at Oak Ridge, and it helped a lot financially. So anyway, I had to make up a few extra credit hours in order to finish on time in undergraduate school.
Tell us about extracurricular activities in college. Were you in a fraternity, and what else did you do?
I was in a fraternity, Phi Gamma Delta, and was a part of various clubs and organizations, all campus-related activities. Was a member of the Scarabean Society, ODK, ended up being a torchbearer. I think that was more the...
What's the torchbearer?
Torchbearer is, I guess, an honor conveyed to, I don't know, 20 or so seniors each year for their work on campus, their campus activities, but I think it's mostly, primarily probably grade point average and service to the university.
Were you a fraternity brother of someone who's been involved in these interview processes?
I have. You mean Dalton Townsend?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I recruited Dalton for the fraternity.
You rushed Dalton, right?
Rushed Dalton, that's right.
Well, that's a claim to fame, and
It is, yeah.
how did you end up going from there to law school? What was that progression?
Well, by the time I had switched to political science and English as my majors, I knew that I was going to have to do something occupationally, and I always thought about law as a possibility. So by the time I was a senior, I was already thinking about law school.
Did you have anybody in your family that had been a lawyer?
No one in the family had been a lawyer. No one close, not in the immediate family. Had cousins who were lawyers, who I knew. I think Arthur Fowler in Loudoun, who was a lawyer, was a close cousin and a good friend. So Dean Warner at the University of Tennessee Law School, his son Tim Warner was a fraternity brother of mine. So I got to know Dean Warner while I was in undergraduate school, and he was encouraging as well. I thought about going to other places, had a scholarship offered from Vanderbilt, for example, but with the Green Scholarship at University of Tennessee, it pretty much paid for everything. So I had no choice. Really didn't. The choice was a great one, and I'm really glad I made it. It was the right one to make, and experience was fantastic there. But financial considerations were certainly paramount too.
Were there any courses that you took in law school or professors that kind of shaped where you ended up in the legal profession?
I don't think there were any particular professors who would have shaped ultimately what I ended up doing. I'll have to say that I really, really enjoyed all of the professors at the UT Law School. I thought they were all dedicated teachers. They were there to teach, and they had that was their primary purpose and role, and they knew that. And they were close to the students, and the experience was, was one that just from a general point of view was the right one, and one that was extremely beneficial.
Do you keep in contact with any of your classmates from law school?
You mean have I to this day?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. This would have been 1962, and at that time the admission requirements, we always heard that it was dictated by somebody in the state, maybe the legislature, but it required the law school to admit anyone with a C average and a minimum LSAT score to be admitted. So we ended up with a class of well over 100, and maybe 60 to 70% attrition rate as a result of that. So we came. So those of us who did survive certainly stayed in touch with a lot of them over the years. A lot of them have become very, very prominent lawyers, many of whom you know, Roger, and a couple of them have, passed away too early, like, Jerry Foster, Stan Guthrie, Bobby Scott, among others. We've got several judges, Donnie Poole here, mm-hmm. Robert Eccles in Nashville. And regrettably, we've had a couple who've spent some time in the penitentiary.
Went the other way.
Went the other way.
You're at that time in law school, did you declare that you were going to do litigation or corporate, or was it kind of a general curriculum?
It was obvious that some of my classmates clearly were leaning toward a particular area of the law, and it was obvious that that's what they wanted to do. They really enjoyed and participated as much as they could in moot court, legal clinic, and what have you. There were others who spent a lot of time, looking at tax codes and things like that, and you knew they weren't not going to be litigators. So, but in my case, I had not decided, did not have any particular inclination one way or the other. By the time I got out, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do.
Did you work for any law firms while you were in law school?
Did not. I worked one summer at the Marshall Space Flight Center in the Office of General Counsel in Huntsville. I worked one summer in the General Counsel's office at TVA in Knoxville. And Jane and I got married midway through law school, so.
One of the best decisions you've made.
Absolutely, absolutely. And she was in graduate school and had an assistantship, so she was actually earning a little money too. And that was good, so we thought we were in high cotton.
Did you participate in extracurricular activities in law school, law review, things like that?
Law review would be the one activity that I would mention there, because it's very time consuming, and if you were active on the law review, you really precluded you doing much else in the way of extracurricular activities.
Before we get to your legal career, let's talk about your family. Tell us about your wife. If we don't get this in, we'll both regret that. So, tell us about your wife. What was her maiden name? And
Jane Waller was her maiden name. She was a student at the University of Tennessee, younger than me, class behind me, considerably younger than me. A music major, piano, was her specialty, and she was a very good student, and I think was becoming or was at the time an accomplished pianist. So, law and the fine arts, I guess maybe there's a good natural connection there. I'm not sure that we've made it work anyway, very well. And I remember going to so many of her recitals. And I remember also one of our law professors and his wife, Forrest Lacey, loved music. So he actually came to virtually every one of Jane's recitals and knew more about, Brahms and Beethoven and all of them than I did. So, but I always thought that was interesting, because Forrest Lacey never impressed me as someone who you would naturally think would be a music lover, but he really was.
Now Jane was from the big city, right? Where was she from?
She was from actually same county, but another town, Philadelphia, Tennessee.
Not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
No, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Tennessee was settled about the same time as Loudoun, right after the Hiwassee Purchase, and I have an old atlas map of Tennessee that dates to, I think, about 1845, and it gives the population of Philadelphia at 400, and population today is 400.
Jane, did she continue with being involved in music in various ways?
After she finished her master's degree, at university, she, of course, working with her master's degree, she was helping teach music and piano at the university with her assistantship, and actually did some programming at WUOT, which she enjoyed very much. And so we still listen to WUOT, particularly when we're driving, through Knoxville.
Tell us about your children.
Children, oldest son is Blair, who's a contractor in Knoxville. Son Will is actually works with the Coca-Cola company, and he's an executive with the Coca-Cola company. He actually started working for Coca-Cola before I became a part of Coca-Cola Enterprises, so I think that's interesting. So he predates me. He started working for coincidentally for Coca-Cola right after he finished college. So still with them. So he's got a lot of good tenure there. Julie is the youngest, and she's an architect in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And she's helped with your home remodeling at times, I understand.
She's helped way beyond the call of duty, and I wish she probably had not been willing to help so much, because I'm the one that writes the checks.
Yeah, between Julie and Jane, there's been
a conspiracy.
Tough, conspiracy. How about grandchildren?
I have 9 grandchildren. Each of the children have 3. And oldest, actually, Blair's daughter, Catherine, his oldest daughter, starts college at the University of the South, Swanee, this year. Yeah. So that's going to be interesting to see. I think she's there because she knows she can drive that 45 minutes and get her laundry done at home. So.
Now, let's move to your career as a lawyer. When you first got out of law school, how did you choose where you were going to practice, and the firm that you were going to practice with?
Well, as you know, Roger, when you're last year in law school, you're always thinking about what you're going to do and where you want to practice and what kind of practice you want to have. And I went through all of that in my mind, talked to a lot of people. One day, Jerry Tipton, one of our partners here at Miller Martin at the time, apparently called Dean Warner and said, we're looking for a new associate. You have anybody you might recommend? So I think Dean Warner thought about it and reflected upon it, decided that I might be a good fit. So he called me in the office and said, why don't you go down and talk to them? So I came to Chattanooga and interviewed with the firm. Firm had a little get-together at a little party at Jerry's house. And so we...
This was before you were offered a job?
Before I was offered a job. Absolutely before I was offered a job. Well, everyone was there. All the partners were there. The wives were there. And
did you and Jane feel like y'all were auditioning in some way?
You really didn't. I thought it was interesting because they were just so warm and welcoming and so easy to be around and such ingratiating people that right away I knew that this would be something really we ought to consider.
Was there a placement office in the law school at that time?
I don't think there. I think Dean Warner was probably the placement
So this
officer.
wasn't an unusual way to get a job?
Not an unusual way at all. Not at all.
And when did you start to work here at Miller Martin?
1965.
Tell us about those when you were an associate. What kind of practice did you do here at Miller Martin?
Well, Miller Martin at the time probably had 12 lawyers.
Who were the senior partners at that time?
Senior partners at the time were Linton Martin, Jerry Tipton, Jim Hitching, Jim Waterhouse, John Linehan, Guy Beatty, Roy Scruggs, and Burkett Miller was here had an office here, but had long since stopped practicing law and had stopped having any role with the firm, but always came in when he was here every day, but he was wheeling and dealing back in his corner office. So those were the senior partners.
You know how many lawyers Miller
Probably
Martin has?
about 12 at the time, I think.
At that time,
yeah,
you know how many they
probably
have?
4 or 5 associates. I'm not sure how many we have now, but maybe
Over 100.
over 100. Yeah, that's right.
20
over
or 30.
100. So, and at the time, being in a firm of 12 lawyers meant going to a large firm. I know, Bass, Berry & Sims in Nashville probably had about that many. Armstrong firm in Memphis, probably Waller Lanston in Nashville, and maybe there was 1 or 2 in Knoxville too. But then there were a couple like that in Chattanooga, Whit Gaither firm, the Stoffel, Caldwell Hagee firm. They were probably about 12-person law firms, but that was considered large.
Did you interview with any other firms, or was this the only firm that you actually?
Only firm I actually interviewed with, yes.
And tell us about what type of work you did here when you started, and what was your salary?
Well, I did my salary. Well, first let me say my salary. I remember first year's salary was $7,500 per annum, and that was good.
That was a large salary.
That was
back then.
a large salary, very, and the firm treated associates very well. So you had if you performed adequately, then you received significant increases every year. So they were very sharing and very fair with their associates. So that's part of the culture. There were probably 4 or 5 other associates here in the office at the time. So anyway, the youngest lawyer in the firm did whatever needed to be done. I mean, he or she did the grunt work, went to court to file motions if that had to be done. We didn't have librarians. We didn't have gophers. We didn't have, the lawyers did that. So we did whatever needed to be done. And in terms of actual substantive law practice, a lot of research, a lot of writing memos, letters, briefs initially, and if you were working on a case, we at Miller Martin at the time, we had it was mostly business and corporate law, and the clients were probably, if not the best, some of the best in Chattanooga. They were all substantial and the envy of everybody, every other firm.
Give us some of those clients.
The American National Bank, Volunteer State Life Insurance Company, Coca-Cola Bottling Company, Thomas, the Crystal Company, and Olin Mills, and interestingly enough, because it's I guess the nature of things, just from a standpoint of evolution, that most all of them are gone. Either they've been acquired by larger entities, or they've phased out, or what have you. But
except there's one constant. Is that correct?
That's right, and that's change. That's right.
Well, there's one constant here, and
that's Coca-Cola. That's true. The Coca-Cola connections we could talk about for a long time. But back to what I did as a young lawyer would be also to handle the court-appointed criminal cases that might come along. At the time, we didn't have public defenders, so the criminal judges, all of whom at the time I really respected and thought highly of, they would pretty much at random appoint other members of the bar to represent indigent defendants. They would go down the list. So that included these people, these senior partners at Miller Martin, many of whom never went to court, unless maybe on occasion to Chancery Court, and didn't really probably didn't know really where it was, because Miller and Morton lawyers, for the most part, spent their time trying to keep their clients out of court. That was their primary objective. And so they gave that duty and responsibility to the youngest, usually the youngest associate. So I got to handle or work on a lot of those cases, and actually tried a few of them in the first 6-7 years that I practiced law. And it was a good experience too, because it really connected you with what really is going on.
You'd have to go up and negotiate with the district attorney.
Go up and negotiate with the district attorney. Learn to, understand difficulties and problems of people from, all parts of society. It's a good experience. I didn't win any of the cases either, but some of them I really tried to win. I mean, all of them I tried to win, or at least do as good a job as I could and for my client. So,
did you also did you work for both people that did trial work here and people that did corporate work?
I did work for both. We didn't have many real trial lawyers here except for Ray Murphy, and I worked a lot with Ray, kind of his number 2 guy, his bag man, I guess you'd say. Wrote a lot of briefs for him, and Ray would try a lot of cases, and they were always fun. He did a great job and handled them very well. So they were. That was a very, very beneficial part of my experience, and I think it demonstrated to me for sure that, the Miller-Martin philosophy of trying to keep your clients out of court is the best of all principles to follow. When I got out of law school, one of our clients, I mentioned the American National Bank, now part of Sun Trust. They were one of the bank was probably one of the, if not the most significant client, certainly a top client of the firms. And Linton Martin, who was a Columbia Law graduate and was probably about 70 years old at the time, generally did most of the commercial side. I'm talking about just the general work of the bank.
Documenting, doing loan documents and stuff like that.
Loan documents, but mostly just in terms of, deposit account issues, bad checks, fraud, always things that come up virtually every day. And Linton handled all of those. And the Tennessee legislature just enacted, at that time, the Uniform Commercial Code, which I had studied in law school. They started teaching Uniform Commercial Code to replace the old negotiable instruments law and some other laws that existed before that. And Linton would come to me every time a bank question came to his office. He'd say, "This is the problem." He'd come to my office. Here I am, 25-year-old associate. Linton had arthritis, so he'd have difficulty coming down the hallway because he had these braces that he had to have on each of his arms. And I would hear him coming down the hallway. And we had open door policy at Miller Martin, so virtually everybody had their door open all the time. And he would walk in and sit down. He'd first ask if he could, he's such a gentleman, ask if he could mind if he disturbed me a little bit. I said, "Absolutely no problem. Come in, Mr. Martin." He would come in, sit down, and he'd talk about a bank problem. And he would say, "Here are the facts, and this is what the answer is under the negotiable instruments law. But I don't have a clue because of the Uniform Commercial Code, what the answer might be."
And he wasn't intending to find out.
No, he was going to ask. He was wanting me to confirm
Right.
it. So, which I would do. When I could, I would say, "I think you got the right answer, Mr. Martin," because typically the answers were the same. But he always came to me. Well, as a result of that, I think over a course of a couple of years, that role and responsibility for the bank work fell on my shoulders. So I started doing most all of it, and that transitioned into doing all the bank commercial loan work, writing loan documents and what have you. So I guess for many years I was probably known as the bank lawyer at Miller Martin. So
You recall referring to him as Mr. Martin. Did the associates refer to all the partners as?
They did. We referred to them as Mr. Martin, Mr. Tipton, Mr. Hitching, and
How long?
And I don't think that was something that was necessarily. Well, I don't think it was expected at the firm as much as it was just simply an idiom that was generally practiced at that time everywhere. So I think that would be an expectation that, in law offices anywhere or business offices or what have you. So things have just changed in that. A lot more informality now than there used to be.
How long were you at Miller Martin before you became a partner?
5 years, almost to a.
Was that the normal track for?
I don't know at that point that that the firm had a normal track. I know Howard Levine was a partner. When I came, he was a couple years ahead of me, and he became a partner, I think, after 5 years. Some of the others were probably 6 or 7, depending on the circumstances. But I don't think we had a normal track.
Tell us about some of the clients that as your career evolved, some of the clients that you've represented or transactions that you've been involved in after your premature demise of criminal practice.
We, the clients were, never thought of myself as being a rainmaker, and really never was a rainmaker. I think the firm.
I think that we might differ on that. But
well, you're very kind. But
what's a rainmaker?
A rainmaker is someone who generates a lot of new business for the firm, and some people are very natural rainmakers, and clients tend to look at them with a lot of confidence and rely on them. Some of them have good, kind of communication skills. That certainly is critical. Good analytical abilities. But anyway, I never really thought of myself as being a rainmaker. We certainly had good rainmakers here, but there were enough clients here at the time. We didn't need a lot more. A number of our senior partners were of independent means. They weren't necessarily interested in growing the firm. They didn't have an objection to it. They weren't opposed to it, but there was no reason for it. When the younger people, some of the younger partners, certainly ahead of me, were not of independent means and saw the value in growing the firm, developing additional clients. And so the firm went through kind of an evolution at this point where we started being a little more aggressive about attracting new business and developing the clients that we had, and people like Guy Beatty and Jim Waterhouse were absolutely critical in that regard, and really did grow the business and grow the firm significantly. But in terms of what I did, a lot of corporate work, in addition to the bank work, bank lending work. We did a lot of acquisitions, divestitures, corporate reorganizations, and what have you. Did a lot of work for Buster Brown Apparel, Crystal Company, and this was before I started doing a lot of work for Coca-Cola, various Coca-Cola enterprises. I was doing some tax-exempt bond financing work for people like Memorial Hospital, and got involved with a couple of startups like CARTA. When CARTA was formed, that's the Chattanooga Area Regional Transportation Authority, a municipal entity. For CARTA, representing CARTA, we bought the old Southern coach lines. I don't remember the year that happened, but the Southern coach lines also had the incline railway, so involved buying the incline railway up Lookout Mountain as well as setting up the bus service here. So Jim Hitching actually in the firm, and I worked on that. It was interesting looking at the title report. This is the real estate title report of all the easements and rights of way going up Lookout Mountain, and we had the title company patch all that together with the surveys and everything, and that had been done. I mean, those rights of way had been in place for 100 years, but still on record. It all looked good.
What attorneys did you look to kind of shape the way you practice law and the way that you wanted to be viewed as a lawyer?
You know, we had, I couldn't say that there was one person within the firm who was my mentor especially. I think they were all mentors. You know, I was very close to Jerry Tipton, very close to Roy Scruggs, enjoyed working very much with Jim Hitching. Of course, enjoyed very much working with Guy Beatty as well, and they were all excellent lawyers and very, very wonderful individuals. So they were easy to emulate and to try to pattern yourself after, both professionally and personally.
Give us a sense of the history of Miller Morton, especially in connection with its relationship with the Coca-Cola bottling interests.
Well, the firm had always represented a company called Coca-Cola Thomas, and Coca-Cola Thomas was the resulting corporate entity from Whitehead and Thomas when they acquired the bottling rights for Coca-Cola for all of North America.
In what year would that have been?
That would have been about 1899, as I remember.
So this firm started that relationship.
So they were representing the company that they set up when Whitehead left soon afterwards, but the company that they set up to try to capitalize on that opportunity. I mean, both of them, when they came back to Chattanooga, I think must have thought that they were the dog that caught the bus, because they had this agreement that they paid $1 for, and they didn't know what they were going to do with it because you needed the capital to get it going. So
these were two Chattanooga businessmen who went to Atlanta.
That's right.
And got the bottling rights and came back to Chattanooga.
Yeah. So they involved the Lupton interest, the Lupton family interest, to help fund a lot of these, a lot of what they needed to do to exploit these rights.
That would have been Jack Lupton's grandfather?
That's right. I believe it was Jack Lupton's grandfather. So, and he was already a person of substantial means, an industrialist, and one of Chattanooga's prominent citizens at the time. And so it was a long history of a lot of people in Chattanooga who were just simply acquaintances of these two lawyers, ended up with franchises. Smallest, so they would grant franchises to sub-franchises, I guess at the time, to various people who wanted to put a little money in and go off to someplace and open a bottling company.
The bottling rights were not perceived to be that valuable by the Coca-Cola company, is that?
They were not perceived to have any value, but I think the Coca-Cola company's perspective was, whatever benefit we receive, whatever monetary benefit we receive, hey, it's something we don't have now, so why not do it?
And the Coca-Cola company model was what? That they would just, the fountain Coke?
Fountain Coke, primarily through pharmacies, fountains at various pharmacies wherever they were all over the country. And it was already very popular.
Just mix the syrup.
Mix the syrup with the carbonated water.
Yep. And so, explain what a bottler would do. So, if you had a bottling franchise for the Coca-Cola company.
Well, a bottler would have to set up the actual bottling machinery to bottle and cap it. And of course, it was only one package at the time, 6.5 ounce.
Package, you mean? Yeah.
One package meaning one size container, 6.5 ounce bottle, glass bottle. And those bottles went through some evolution before they became what we know as the classic Coca-Cola bottle. But they would have to have machinery to bottle it, and then they would have to have means of transporting it to various retail outlets. They would buy the syrup. Syrup would come directly from the Coca-Cola company, but the syrup being what goes into it to make the Coca-Cola together with the water and the CO2. But the Coca-Cola Thomas would get a royalty on all of the syrup that they used. And so, but it would take a considerable amount of capital at the time to do that, and a lot of them failed. There's stories where one of them might have a franchise for a certain major city even, and just couldn't make it, and would come back to Chattanooga to the Thomas Company and say, sorry, I just failed, I've run out of money, I can't make it anymore, I'm insolvent. And the Thomas Company would say, well, how about trying this other city? And would actually loan them some more money to go try it at another place. And after a while, they all became successful, and a lot of them very wealthy.
And the Miller Morton was representing the Coca-Cola Thomas Company.
That's right.
And that moved to a more broader representation of bottling interest. Explain that.
That's a, it took a long time, actually, over a great number of years. So I don't remember exactly when it was, but the Coca-Cola Thomas Company, based here in Chattanooga, eventually decided that, and they had a lot of shareholders, by the way, most of them Chattanoogans, but
most of them very wealthy now.
Most of them very wealthy now. Decided that it made. I think the Coca-Cola Company came to them and said, "Look, you're a middleman. You're providing some value to this supply chain, but I think we could provide more value if you weren't in the middle, and so we will buy you for a certain." I think they made them an offer they felt like was just too lucrative to pass up. So the Thomas Company disappeared and merged into the Coca-Cola Company.
Yeah, okay.
And so I think at the time at the firm, of course, I was here and had been here. I can't remember the exact year. I think that might have been late 70s or maybe about 1980 or something. But I think we were fearful that, hey, we just lost a big client, which we had, and thought maybe our Coca-Cola business would, our connection with Coca-Cola would be a matter of history now. So that actually did not turn out to be the case. What happened was there were a number of, at least 2 or 3 people in Chattanooga, including the Luptons, Carl Navarre, Summerfield Johnston, all of whom felt that consolidation of the bottling business was certainly inevitable, and that it made good sense economically, and it made good sense for the system. The Lupton companies began acquiring some additional bottlers that were adjacent to some of their existing territories. Carl Navarre, who had been affiliated with the Thomas Company, decided that he would make some acquisitions. He was a good client of the firm. The Lupton companies were not a client of the firm at the time. But Carl Navarre acquired the Coca-Cola Bottling Company in Miami, St. Louis, and some others, and he was a real entrepreneur. Unfortunately, he passed away much, much too early. Somerville Johnston, who was at the time a very, very small Coca-Cola bottler, really Cleveland, Tennessee, and a few other Lafayette, Georgia, a few other little territories, decided that he would also make some acquisitions, and he had enough support behind him financially, both of his own family and some others, that he started making acquisitions and bought. First big acquisition was Coca-Cola Bottling Company Midwest, the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And we, the firm, represented him, and we did a lot of helped with all those acquisitions. So it went from Coca-Cola Midwest to Cincinnati Coca-Cola Bottling Company, Louisville, Lexington, some smaller bottlers in and around Chattanooga that he consolidated into Cleveland. We bought some bottlers in Illinois, Central Illinois, not Chicago. We bought Mid-American, Kansas City, and and then after Carl Navarre passed away, we actually ended up purchasing St. Louis from his family estate. So it got to the point where Somerville, through a lot of good foresight and just good intuition, ended up with he had about 10% of the United States, and controlled it all in the Johnston Company. So we did all that, and all those were good acquisitions and great for the firm. And as we were getting into the Midwest, which was big, a little bit more, I should say, where the plants had collective bargaining agreements with labor unions, we had to expand. The firm had to expand its labor and employment practice. So that's when we absorbed Clements, Ingham, and Trumpeter, who were, I thought, outstanding labor lawyers located here in Chattanooga, and they became a part of the firm. And we gave them plenty of work to do right then.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Immediately they had a book of business.
They had plenty before, but they had even more now. So, and one of those guys is still here too, John Bodie.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that was probably the first chapter in it all. And
this is a good place to stop. So we'll take a break and be back shortly.
Okay. Good.
Lowry, in addition to representing successful banking entities like the American National Bank, did you have experience in doing in your practice to be involved in some non-successful banking enterprises?
You're probably referring to the Hamilton Bank closure. The Hamilton Bank in Chattanooga in 1976 was, I think, the largest financial institution in Chattanooga. It was a subsidiary of Hamilton Bank Shares, which had bank subsidiaries in other parts of the state. This firm was contacted in 1976, as I remember, by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. They wanted us to act as Tennessee counsel for them because they told us that in the utmost secrecy, that they were going to close the bank. At the time, the bank closure was the third largest in FDIC history. I think the call came to Jim Waterhouse because of his Harvard Law School connection. So Jim Waterhouse, at that time, I guess I had already established myself as the bank lawyer, the bank partner in the firm. So Jim said, all right, here it is. They want you in St. Louis at the Federal Reserve Bank, where the FDIC is going to negotiate a purchase and assumption agreement with 3 possible bank holding companies in the state. There were 2 from Memphis and 1 in Nashville. One of those in Memphis happened to be First Tennessee. So we went to Nashville to negotiate the terms of that agreement for at least 1 week, and then came back for another 3 or 4 day session before the bank actually closed. And I remember at the time that we would work through sometimes almost all night trying to get the agreement worked out. But we would look at the stock market, and Hamilton Bank shares was still trading at, I don't know, so many dollars a share. I knew that once the bank closed that those shares would be virtually worthless, but it turns out that my mother-in-law, that was her primary asset, was a few thousand shares of Hamilton Bank shares. And of course, I was precluded from doing anything about that or even telling her about it, and wouldn't have anyway. But so she lost really the bulk of her net worth as a result of that. So the bank closed, and it turns out that the FDIC became a very, very valuable client of the firm for many years.
Still.
I think it still is a very valuable client of the firm. The Hamilton Bank shares, the Hamilton Bank closure was probably much simpler than the later FDIC work that the firm had as a result of the Butcher Bank closings, most of those in Knoxville and other parts of Tennessee. But we represented the FDIC in those too. By that time, I was so involved in Coca-Cola work that I really didn't participate much in the Butcher Bank closings.
Did you do, in your being a partner here at Miller Morton, did there come a time that you took on some administrative duties in connection with the firm?
I mentioned this earlier. It's kind of an interesting vignette, I guess, into my exposure here. Right after I became a partner in the firm, this would have been in the early 1970s. So you got to put yourself back in the 1970s if you can. But they decided that, well, a young partner, we'll give him some responsibility. Nobody likes to do the human resources work here in the office, secretaries and clerks and what have you. We'll let him take on that responsibility. And I think even then we probably called it the personnel function. I don't know. Things change. Now it's of course human resources. So one of my first jobs was to hire a secretary for somebody in the firm. So a candidate came from somewhere in South Carolina, and she was young, she was very attractive, and she came with glowing recommendations from a very large firm in South Carolina. We went through the application process, and I had one of the other secretaries give her some kind of typing test, because this is before word processing was very sophisticated. She passed all of those, and boy, she was really looked like a fine addition to the firm. So she was moving to Chattanooga because her husband, who was an engineer, was coming to work for one of the companies here in Chattanooga. So a few weeks later, she showed up, and a couple of days after she was here, I walked by her office, and I happened to see a little statuette on her desk, and I was curious about what it was, and I didn't say anything about it. And later on, I think when she was gone, I went over to look, and I could tell it was a statue of a nude female. And it said, and there was a little caption under it, it said, "Sex has no place in the office, so let's find one." So anyway, she didn't work out long term, and I guess the best part of it is I was relieved from my human resources responsibilities.
You had a very short term.
I had a very short term in HR, I'm glad to say.
HR person. Before we get to we'll call this your second career and how that transitioned, tell us about your involvement in bar association activities and how you feel about that part of what you did when you were practicing law?
Gosh, looking back on all that with, a lot of true, sentiment and nostalgia, really. Not only with the Chattanooga Bar Association, but also,
What positions did you hold?
Well, I was the president of the Board of Law Examiners for, several years, and enjoyed doing that. All the work of the bar examiner.
What does the bar? What do they do?
The bar examiners are charged by the Supreme Court to administer the bar exam for law graduates who are seeking to be admitted to the bar. So we work directly for the Supreme Court of Tennessee. So they are. I'm not sure exactly what the constituency of the bar examiners are now, but there were 3 of us in those days, and we had a number of assistants that worked with us, we actually supervised the administration of the bar examination for all of these folks. I remember, it's interesting because we see all these young graduates of law schools taking the Tennessee bar. When I finished law school in 1965, there were maybe 3 women in our class, and by the time I finished my tour of duty on the bar exam as a bar examiner, that would have been 20 years ago, the majority of them were women. And I think that trend has continued.
Did you start the process of being involved in the Tennessee Bar Examiners by grading tests? And
I started as an assistant, so
Yeah.
I was writing a question or 2 for each bar exam and then grading those answers, and so that's how I started. And
was that a pleasant task, or did it require a lot of time?
It required a lot of time, but it was enjoyable. I thought it was pretty obvious that people who know how to write well, who can write fluently and express themselves on paper are at a real advantage in whatever they do. So those who had the right education are going to be, they're going to benefit as a result of it.
And these were essay questions completely.
Questions. Absolutely essay questions.
So it was time consuming to frame the questions and to grade them.
Yeah.
What other positions did you have of leadership in connection with the local bar or the state bar or the Bar Foundation?
Served a term as the president of the Chattanooga Bar Association and on the Board of Governors. And we had really very, very good and effective and valuable members of our Board of Governors in those days, and very good staff working within the Chattanooga Bar Association. That was a way to really stay in touch, and as a part of the legal profession, something that I didn't have since I did not get into court very often and see lawyers. I have an opportunity to see lawyers as much as people who do litigation would. And then the Tennessee Bar Foundation was just a very valuable experience and very rewarding experience because of all the good work that the Tennessee Bar Foundation does. And that's broader because it's the whole state. And it covers, you get to really you get a better understanding and appreciation for what happens from all corners of the state because of the various applicants for funding, what's happening within each of the legal aid societies in all parts of the states, and you can appreciate that they're not any different from what we are here in Chattanooga. I think, both with the Chattanooga Bar Association and the law examiners, and especially with the Bar Foundation, just have such capable and competent administrative and executive people too, and that made it so much easier and much more rewarding.
What position did you hold with the Tennessee Bar Foundation?
I was, I guess, chairman or president for a year or so.
When was that, do you recall?
Don't remember exactly. Early 90s, I think.
Did you feel that your involvement in the bar association that you've gone through is important for other lawyers to be involved in these type of activities?
I do, because if you're a lawyer, you're a part of a profession, and if you're a part of a profession, you need that give and take, that association, that communication with others in your profession, because you learn from that. You really do learn from that, and you probably have. You may not realize it at the time, but you probably have a lot to contribute too.
Explain how the profession of the practice of law, is it moving, you think, more toward the business of practice of law, or is that a fair statement or an unfair statement?
I think it's a fair statement that it's moving more toward a business, the practice of law. That's my impression.
And why do you see that?
I think it's probably financial. I think expectations of financial reward are probably have grown considerably. I think a lot of law graduates come out of law school with heavy student debt, which they need to pay off, and also they're wanting to probably have families and do other things with their with the income that they have. So it just raises the bar, and so they have to look at it, or want to look at it, more in financial terms than in professional terms.
Now let's talk about your transition from being a practicing lawyer here at Miller Morton to your next career. Kind of how did that get started, and tell us how you transitioned, and then we'll talk about what all you did while you were at Coca-Cola Enterprises.
Well, as I said, I was involved deeply with a lot of the bottler consolidations, particularly on behalf of the Johnston Bottling Group. And I mentioned the fact that we'd made a number of acquisitions and got to the point where probably about 10% of the United States was owned by the Johnston Group, bottling rights. And of course, those bottling rights are perpetual, and most all of us consider very, very valuable.
And that would be Summerfield Johnston.
That would be Summerfield Johnston and his and other share owners, but he was the predominant entrepreneurial kind of spirit.
And he's located, well, he would say he's located in McDonald, Tennessee.
He would say he's located at Bendabout Farm or at Chattanooga. Yeah, definitely. McDonald, Tennessee. And the Johnston Company was managed and operated very effectively. And that came to the notice of the Coca-Cola Company. The Coca-Cola Company itself had, at the same time, arrived at the conclusion that consolidation of various bottling entities made sense from a standpoint of operational efficiencies, synergies, and so it had acquired a number of bottling entities itself, including the Lupton bottling entities that the Lupton family had owned, a company, the Beatrice bottling entity in Los Angeles and Miami. They'd acquired Miami. They ended up forming Coca-Cola Enterprises in 1986 and funded Coca-Cola Enterprises, which is a new entity, public company, New York Stock Exchange company, funding it with all of these bottling entities, which were probably as much as, I think, about 40% of the U.S. And it had operated from 1986 to 1991. In 1991, the management of the Johnston Company and Coca-Cola Company got together and decided they should merge the Johnston Bottling Company and Coca-Cola Enterprises. And after much discussion, negotiation, and what have you, that merger took place in late December 1991. As a result of that, the Johnston management, which I think the Coca-Cola Company felt had been doing a good job running the Johnston companies, took over essentially the management of the combined entities. So we had at that point probably over 50% of the U.S. So Somerville Johnston, our good client, became CEO and Chief Executive Officer of Coca-Cola Enterprises, which is a surviving entity.
It was the minnow swallowed the whale. Is that
That's
correct?
right. It was kind of that. Although the Johnston Company was certainly large in its own right, but it was much smaller then. I think we had Johnston had maybe $1 billion in revenues, and Coca-Cola Enterprises before the merger had maybe $4 billion in revenue. So I think we ended up at about a $5 billion company at the time. So
The Coca-Cola Company decided that the bottlers were better at running the bottle business, and they were better running their part of the
that's right, because the Coca-Cola Company's management of Coca-Cola Enterprises was made up of former Coca-Cola Company executives who were fine people, but they were not, had no experience really, or very little experience in the world of, I guess the more blue-collar world of managing a bottling company.
Explain to what a bottler does every day versus what the Coca-Cola Company does every day.
Well, the Coca-Cola Company every day, they decide on marketing, marketing programs, advertising programs. They decide on new product development, research, and research, and what have you. They're not street people.
They're
bottlers.
They're a marketing company.
They're a marketing company. The bottlers are the people who produce a product, distribute it, sell it, and take it up and down the street. So they're different. I mean, they're very different in terms of they both complement each other, and they're both entities or functions are joined at the hip, and they're both very critical and very important, but they're different.
And there's a natural tension between the two.
Natural tension, absolutely natural tension.
And so when the Johnston Company became now having the bottling rights to 50% of the country, what steps did they take about who would be doing their legal work and how that would work out?
Well, Somerville asked me if I would become general counsel, and I accepted that on the condition that I remain a part of Miller Martin and just simply have the title of general counsel and still be a part of the firm, because I didn't want to leave the firm. And the firm had been part of my life for many years, and they all agreed to that. And so the firm continued to do the work of not only the old Johnston Company, but now this new entity, not a new entity, but this merged entity that which was much larger, based in Atlanta. So all of a sudden our workload increased significantly, and I think we handled it very well.
And the large law firms in Atlanta who were doing the work for Coca-Cola when they had Coca-Cola Enterprises, they were scratching their heads, were they not?
I'm sure they were. They were good people, obviously, and still are. And they're large enough that it really didn't affect them too adversely, I think.
And what did Somerville do with his large legal department that they had there at the Coca-Cola Enterprise?
Well, we did. They had a few people. We certainly kept those in-house that we thought were really making a valuable contribution, and those that weren't were the Coca-Cola Company or other affiliated enterprises found places for them. So everything worked out for them as well. But we essentially replaced that legal function with our people at Miller & Martin.
Our people being Miller Martin, we started doing the work for the legal department and the work for the several Atlanta firms who had been doing that work.
That's right. Yeah.
And so explain how that worked through the 90s and your role in that.
Well, that continued. That continued for another 2 or 3 years. I was still with Miller & Martin officially, but carrying on. Really, I was general counsel for the company, but by that time I had to devote all of my time and effort, obviously, to Coca-Cola Enterprises, and whatever clients I had left here at Miller & Martin, other people had to assume responsibility for them. So it was exclusively Coca-Cola Enterprises who I was working for. The Coca-Cola Enterprises went on a further acquisition, continued the acquisition strategy, and were buying other domestic North American bottlers during this period. So, and we were growing considerably. The firm represented us in all of those acquisitions. We bought Coca-Cola Bottling Company of New York. We bought Canada. We bought a big bottler in Texas. We bought Western Pennsylvania. I may have mentioned Chicago, Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Chicago, and then some others in the Midwest. And we started expanding in Europe. Our first bottling acquisition in Europe was the Netherlands. And we felt that having a presence in Europe was a natural move for us, because Western Europe more closely resembled the way that we operated in North America. And we felt like that some of the ways in which we went to market in the U.S., some of those practices and disciplines, that we could take to Europe and benefit from them. So we started our European acquisition strategy during that period of time. And the firm represented, Miller & Martin firm represented Coca-Cola Enterprises in that process. Those were interesting times, certainly very interesting times. Of course, we ended up acquiring, Great Britain, Belgium, and France. So significant presence in North America. The company actually grew to $20 billion in revenues by the time I retired. So, and all that was done by acquisitions.
Before we get to let's talk about you. We have you now, and you're in Atlanta. You've kind of moved to Atlanta to become the general counsel. And how did the transition go? How did you move up the ladder in that company?
Well, I think after about 3 years or so, I think this would be 94 or 95, somewhere around there, Summerfield Johnston and the other executives of the Coca-Cola Company told me they'd like me to take on additional responsibilities within the company, over and above just being general counsel. And that in order to do that, I would need to come in-house, in effect, and become a part of the company and employed by the company. And so I agreed to do that. I felt like, at this point in my life and career, a transition wouldn't be that bad. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I'd been devoting all my practice to one client anyway, and it seemed to be the natural thing to do. Atlanta certainly was not my favorite place to live, but it was fine. It was nothing, had no objections to it, and certainly I loved all the people. And loved working with the people, so I made that transition.
You and Jane bought a
then.
condo down there.
We had a condominium there, which we enjoyed. Of course, she enjoyed all the shopping and other things that were available. So,
So how long did you stay in the position as general? What was your title? The general counsel?
I think I was senior vice president and general counsel. That was for maybe a year or so, and then after that, we brought in a new general counsel, someone who had been a lawyer at the Coca-Cola company or within the Coca-Cola system for a number of years, and someone who had been serving as our general counsel for our European business. And we thought highly of him, and so we made him, we nominated him as general counsel for the company, and I took on additional management, administrative responsibilities. So I became, I think, a chief administrative officer, senior vice president, chief administrative officer, but the general counsel reported to me, and a number of other functions as well, including human resources, believe it or not.
You're back. You made a full circle. You didn't tell them about your previous abysmal experience in that?
Did not make full disclosure.
In addition to human resources, what other aspects of the company were you in charge of as you moved out of the general counsel?
Well, I think the investor relations would have been probably the most significant of those. And I worked a lot with public affairs, community affairs function.
Do you think that your training as a lawyer helped you in places in connection with your moving into becoming an executive in the business arena?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think I was fortunate that throughout my practice with Miller and Morton, representing corporations and businesses, many of which were small businesses, I could see, I saw a lot of failures, I saw a lot of successes. I saw a lot of management styles that I thought were very effective, and I saw a lot that were not. And so I witnessed that, and I think I learned a lot from it. So my experience as a lawyer, particularly the experiences that I had, I think were very helpful and very valuable in that respect. You see people, managers who see people as who are consensus builders, and they see value in all their employees and all their people, that they're good listeners. I think those are the managers who are successful, and those who are not threatened by surrounding themselves with people who are going to question their judgment, question their actions, and who don't feel threatened by people who may be smarter or more talented than they are. They're going to be more successful than those who are more despotic and who are more, dictatorial, I guess.
How did the transition then from becoming the administrative vice president to your next position, and tell us what you ultimately became there at the Coca-Cola Enterprises?
Well, I don't know. I think at one point when Somerville Johnston decided he was going to slow down and start phasing out, the board started thinking about who his replacement would be. And most public companies first look internally for possible candidates, because when you look for a successor, particularly for the top position, if you find them outside the company, you never know exactly what it is you're going to get. So there are a lot of questions and uncertainties there, but typically if it's an internal candidate, you're more likely to know what you're going to end up with. So So I think the board first looked pretty carefully internally, and maybe I was the last guy standing. I don't know, but anyway, and I think Summerfield was encouraging, certainly encouraging, and wanted me to take on that role.
He was supportive of that.
He was very supportive, and he was going to remain as chairman, which he did for a couple of years. And so I agreed to do it and had full support of the board. And at that time, I think the Coca-Cola company still owned about 30 to 35% of our shares, and the Coca-Cola company was supportive. Of course, the Coca-Cola company had been undergoing significant transition at the top levels during this period. So they had a new CEO at the time at the Coca-Cola company, and so they were supportive. So I took it on, and I was ready for it. I didn't think I would ever, in the back of my mind, I never thought I'd ever do anything like that, but I did it for several years.
How long did you do it, Larry?
Well, it started in, was it 2000, the year 2000? So I did it for 3 or 4 years, and then we decided I was going to slow down and stop, because it's not an easy role, as you know, and I'm getting up in years. So I asked the board to appoint another person as chief executive officer, with the understanding that I would stay as chairman, but in an executive role as chairman, which I did for another couple of years. And it turns out that that transition didn't hold very long, so I came back as CEO. I don't remember exactly the years and all that. Came back as CEO for another period of time while we found another replacement, and the replacement we found at Coca-Cola Enterprises is still the chief executive officer now.
Explain the difference between being a CEO and just a chairman, or even if it's an executive chairman.
Well, I think there's a lot of debate right now within corporate circles, both from a legal point of view and just simply an investor point of view, whether or not the position should be separated. And in many companies, they are required to be separated, and I think there are a lot of good arguments for that. But a lot of companies still combine those positions, chairman and CEO. I think it depends on the circumstances, whether or not it's a good idea or not. I've never known, I'm not aware of any situation where the functions have been separated that it's turned out badly, whether it's executive chairman or not. In our case, I guess it depends on your definition, but in our case, an executive chairman really kept some functional responsibilities. And that's why we refer to it as executive chairman. But any chairman of a public company right now is going to be an executive in a large sense, because of the awesome responsibilities that he has.
Tell us about what if any changes in your work habits when you're practicing law full-time and when you are an executive of a company full-time.
It's a big question. I think it requires, both of them require a lot of focus and homework. Certainly that's a commonality. Dedication, energy, both require both of those. Tolerance, understanding. I think the big difference is that if you're an executive, a chief executive officer of a company, there's so many people, so many constituents looking to you for leadership. So you can't hide behind your desk. You can't run away from it. You can't call an associate or another partner in and say, hey, I want you to handle this for me. The buck stops right there, and that's a big difference.
Give us a sense. You said that the Coca-Cola Enterprises got to a $20 billion a year revenues. That's a How many employees did it have?
Yes, I remember when I retired with about 50,000 employees.
Was that pretty heady for a guy from Loudoun to
That's
end
right.
up running a $20 billion, 50,000 employee company?
You know, yeah, I'm sure it was. I didn't really even think about it in those terms. I mean, we had so many good people who were there and who were doing great work and carrying out their responsibilities diligently and carefully, and you felt comfortable with them around you. So that was reassuring and very, very comforting.
You had to when you came when Coca-Cola Enterprises started into Europe, you had to travel to Europe, I assume, on occasions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever take a trip on a Concorde to?
Took a couple of Concorde trips back when the Concorde was flying. It was a little shaky in those days. I guess it was the last few years that they allowed the Concorde to fly, but it was a great experience. The fuselage in the Concorde is not that large, and but boy, it sure is fast. And I remember flying from both New York and Washington. I think once to Paris. I just flew it a couple of times, once to Paris and then maybe once to London. I think it was 3 hours and 19 minutes. And it was like clockwork. They knew exactly how long it would take. And unlike flights today, when it depends on the wind and a number of other factors, whether you arrive on time or not the Concorde, it was always right on time, within a minute or two.
So when you retired from your position at CCE, what did you do? What have you done in those years since then?
Well, all my good friends like you, Roger, here at Miller Martin, have graciously allowed me to have an office here and keep a desk here, even though so it gives me some place to come and get out of Jane's way at home. But I enjoy it very much.
We threaten to give you work to do sometimes.
That's right. That would be scary for the clients if you gave me any work to do. It would be, but I enjoy coming to the office, seeing everybody, and talking with just on a daily basis, all of you, about various things that you're doing and working on. And then, aside from that, I still serve on 3 corporate boards, which I enjoy doing very much. And
what does that entail?
Well, that entails, it's the service on the board of directors. So the Dixie Group is one of them, the McKee Foods Corporation, the Little Debbie people, another one, and the Jackson Furniture Industries Company, which is all three of which are doing very well, by the way. Not because of anything I like.
You've been on the Jackson Furniture Board for
long time.
Long time.
Even before the Coca-Cola days. So.
What about civic activities? How do you pick and choose what you're going to get involved in?
Well, I think it's based on really what I might be interested in at the time and what I might feel like I enjoy doing. So that varies from time to time. I'm not doing anything really actively at this present time, but have in the course of the past. So.
You and Jane
very rewarding. I think Jane's much busier than I am on not-for-profit enterprises, particularly here in Chattanooga. She stays busier than me, that's for sure. So she's still very active in all of it.
You and Jane have been active in supporting the University of Tennessee as your college and law school,
right?
In the past, is that correct?
Yeah, and I think particularly probably the School of Music at the University of Tennessee. So, and that's been very rewarding and hopefully beneficial for the university.
What do you do in your spare time now? You said you're not that active in your community work. What do you do in your spare time?
Try to get a little decent exercise, which I guess all the physician's advice require.
What do you do?
And, well, mostly I used to jog, but now it's mostly walking or bike riding. And then, you know, I love reading. I don't think there's anything that I enjoy any more than reading.
What do you read?
A lot of histories.
Would you consider yourself a Civil War buff?
I'm a Civil War buff, but I'm certainly not as knowledgeable, anywhere close to being as knowledgeable as people like Sam Elliott and others here in Chattanooga.
But that is one of your areas.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And where do you spend your time now? In Chattanooga or other places?
Mostly in Chattanooga. We have a little place in Virginia that we go to, which is not too far from our daughter and her family. And so we enjoy visiting up there, which we do probably once a month at least. I bought a little farm up there for the family to use when they're visiting. Julie's brothers like to hunt and spend time in the outdoors, so it's a way for them to visit, spend some time with her family, and not infringe on her. So, and that's worked out well.
What do you look forward to in the next part of your life as you move past your work life and further into retirement?
Well, I think probably I would just say more of the same. Certainly enjoy what I'm doing now and the amount of leisure that I have and what I'm doing. So probably, hopefully more of the same. Let's hope the health stays good, and we give thanks for that every day. So
we have some props behind you. Mm-hmm. So I guess now that the people have understood your relationship with the Coca-Cola company or Coca-Cola Enterprises and the bottling interest, you could explain who put those back there and what they show.
Well, these are all commemorative bottles. The Coca-Cola company, as part of its marketing, will produce a number of commemorative bottles from time to time. And so these are some examples of some of those commemorative bottles that have been produced. And I have collected a lot over the years and enjoy seeing them. So, they came out of my office. There are many more in there, along with a lot of other Coca-Cola paraphernalia.
You will not find any Pepsi products here at Miller Morton.
Won't see any Pepsi products. The brand Coca-Cola has not only grown in value, sustained its value over more than 100 years through all sorts of mismanagement, abuse, and what have you, and still, I guess, is, if not the top, certainly one of the top two most valuable brands in the world, and I think that will always be the case.
What Coca-Cola products do you normally drink?
I love Coke Zero and Diet Coke, caffeine-free Diet Coke. I actually like most all of them. So, and Dasani, love Dasani.
Oh yeah, we got Dasani. So we have a lot of Coke products here at Miller Morton.
Good, keep it up.
Is there anything else that you wish I had asked you that you'd like to tell us about?
I can't think of anything.
Maybe another tip to Jane, right?
Right, that's right. Thanks to her, certainly, for hanging with me all these years through all of this, all this transition. She's been very supportive and very loving, and I guess in terms of just the career choices, experiences I've had, and personal life as well, if I had to do it all over again, I certainly wouldn't change anything. So it's been a great ride and a lot of fun.
Is there any of your accomplishments that have given you the most satisfaction that you can point out, or would that be difficult?
That would be difficult to point to any one thing. I guess I could say I hope I would be remembered as someone who, treated everybody the same, regardless of their position or station in life, and valued every individual as a person, regardless of what they were or what they did. So I think that's been one of the reasons why I've been, done what I've done is because I see everybody as a equal human being.
Well, I think I would say that you would certainly be remembered in that way, and we appreciate your spending this time with us. And as just a personal note, you're a great partner.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.